And we are now to the last presenter of today's panel, Tomasz Nowak, again from Poland, ethnomusicologist, between the stage and the jury table, Polish case.
Thank you very much. The third time I have to say that when browsing through a collection of Polish documentalists of traditional music, almost from the very beginning we may notice quite frequent lamenting of its looming demise. Undoubtedly, to a large extent, it was an expression of nostalgia for the disappearing world common in many researchers of culture. However, in the situation of Polish society, which from the end of the 18th century until the end of the First World War was devoid of state sovereignty, this documenting and popularization of the phenomena of local culture was inscribed in the strategy of preservation of national identity, and each change in culture was regarded as a threat to the existence of the nation. It is no wonder then that researchers of musical traditions developed a feeling of a special social role, which was not abated after the independence was regained. Quite to the contrary, musicologists and musicians interested in the traditional music of the interbellum period quite often allowed themselves to denounce phenomena which, in their view, were detrimental for the traditional, and to publish again and again appeals to the society. Stanisław Mierczyński wrote in 1934. Further work after the collection and inspection of materials regarding music, song, and rituals of a given area would mainly consist in creation of choral ensembles, folk bands, whereas in many cases certain instruments would need to be rejected, those that have recently become fashionable, and the instruments of old or the disappearing ones reintroduced, like in many areas bagpipe, in other the hurdy-gurdy, and etc. This and similar appeals were reflected in a trend dynamically developing already in the 30s of scenic presentation of folk theaters and folk music festivals, which were influenced undoubtedly by the ethnomusicologists through their publications. This influence increased in Poland after the Second World War, when, due to political changes in our part of Europe, the Polish United Workers' Party, a puppet organization of the Soviet Union, came to power. Following the Soviet examples, the communist ideologists strived to violently engage all professional groups in the political and social reconstruction of the country. In opinion of Zofia Lissa, the powerful musicologist of this time, who just came in this time from Moscow, the ethnomusicologists were expected to, among others, document the whole repertoire before the planned quick disappearance of musical folklore resulting from changes of social and economical relations, support with repertoire the amateur and professional artistic community, which in turn was being coaxed to mass-stylize the musical folklore, and ensure expert support in staging and styling of folklore, which would lead to its control. Despite the political attempts, the musical culture did not disappear, and the collection of records started in the 40s still goes on. In their turn, amateur and professional artistic communities, freed from the ideology's pressure, gradually emancipated themselves and today only seldom use the patterns of traditional music or just keep to the patterns acquired during the first 25 years of cooperation with the academic community. However, surprisingly good. The expert activity of ethnomusicologists was accepted on the ground of festivals, which start in 40s, but it's very dynamically grow up after 60s, giving a wide possibility to influence the shape of cultivated musical traditions. It became possible to due to the fact that the post-war festivals from the very outset were forced into the straitjacket of the competition. No show, no review, competition. Usually proceeded by preliminaries on a local level. However, the competition formula was initially criticized. Here's an opinion of Włodzimierz Kotoński, composer. In the view of the majority of the performers and people who are close to those affairs, this review in Podhale region should above all be a review, and in generally, instead of establishing consecutive places, all bands should rather be qualified in a way that it practices in festivals to group first, second and third prizes. The bands which achieved fifth and sixth place were not so much worse in playing level than the first band, and the prizes they received were often worthless. These kinds of prizes, and then ignoring the bands which did not receive the prizes, caused disappointment in many Highlanders, many of whom went home with a strong conviction that they would never again take part in such competitions. This disappointment and turning away from festivals seems to be a constant element of such events. We know from many examples of local festivals, all the more so that lack of award does not equate to non-authenticity or non-traditionality or low quality of performance. The formula of the competition by itself limits the number of available prizes. At the same time, the level of preservation of elements of traditional music culture that are preferred in competitions, for example, repertoire related to rituals or dimmed archaic specific scales and melodic solution, interesting rhythmic and agogic phenomena, and so on, is uneven, and even within the frames of relatively small region, considerable differences are observed. And in huge interregional festival competitions, ensembles from various regions and social groups meet. In reality, the awarded prizes consist from the outset of a collection of results of a function dependent mainly on the level of preservation of tradition of a given community, further the detail of reconstruction, and only then on the performance skill. This goes in a way against the competition's formula, which by its nature bears towards the comparison of mainly skill, towards which and similar phenomena are grouped. For example, regional federation, groups, league, rankings, and so on. And the chances are balanced out, for example, handicaps. Against this background, the competition of traditional music in Poland are an absolutely separate phenomenon. They are governed by very specific rules. These rules, by their uniqueness, are often misunderstood in communities, breed frustration and confusion. It would be naive to believe that perennial losers will affirm the supremacy of performers from other regions whose music is made according to alien rules, sometimes conflicting with those cultivated by them. The verdict of the jury becomes incomprehensible and unacceptable. A long-term lack of expected results also causes the patron and donors to turn away from the performance. In effect, the sustained defeats cause change of profile of activity or its full rejection. In the awarded communities, the folklore activity gains an increasing support. In fact, really the generation of musicologists of the time did not see a threat in the form of competition. What they saw in competitions was a great opportunity to encourage musicians and singers to cultivate rare and archaic phenomena and to limit the influx of new ones which they treat as a very special mission, which, truth be told, was successful to a certain extent. In 1949, Jadwiga Sobieska wrote enthusiastically, "Encouraged by us, the traditional musicians again started to play sierszenkas, mazankas, marynias, and the wedding bagpipes." Here you see those instruments. It is no wonder that Jadwiga Sobieska had similar hopes for the folklore festivals, which were to activate the authentic folklore in the field. By performing a certain selection of the traditional communication aimed at promotion of its most previous values. In reality, singers and musicians who found their place in such events after the first phase of spontaneous and off-the-cuff scenic behavior, in the repeated competitive situation and in the course of gaining positive or negative experiences, were faced with what that game theory calls the iterated prisoner's dilemma. Of course, it's just a canonical version of this. Iterated is most complicated. The retaining of a privileged and attractive award-winning position is dependent not only on own productions but also on productions of competitors, who may not only present folklore remembered by performer or their predecessors, but also reach back to repertoire learned from more distant sources. In this situation, the most effective strategy, ensuring if not success, then at least equilibrium, is the protection of own repertoire, and on the other hand, stretching one's activity closer and closer to the border of the hoax, especially that the probability of being exposed is small and punishment is not too painful. One of the fiddler during a national competition in Kazimierz told, "In the old times, sir, were the music parties and the weddings, and today is the time of folklores. So during folklores we play in a totally different way." Musicians are intelligent and they uniquely feel who likes what and adapt quickly to the suggestion of ethnographers and or musicologists. Very often, their activity is also affiliated with the local community center and is meant with instructors. One of the examples. Throughout Poland, one can observe a discrete engineering of the musical traditional culture, by selection or book-based supplementing of melodies, tweaking of lyrics, or even re-education the recent sax and accordion players as a village fiddlers or harmonium players. Quite often, the improvers of traditional culture include, apart from ethnographers, of graduates of musicology or other musical faculties. They are aided by the meticulously observed regulations of festivals, minutes of the jury, and reviews of competition presentation, treated by the instructor as guidelines for limitation and trend in force. One of the examples is a limitation of maximum 3 people in a band, a detailed list of instruments deemed to be traditional, as well as a perpetual ban of accordion. It is also not a random occurrence that a year after the main prize in Kazimierz Dolny Festival went to a group performing funeral songs, the next year saw a real deluge of such presentations. A constant element of festivals is the presentation of unique rite and ballad songs, which currently remain only in the memories of single representatives of rural communities and were reminded to band by suggestions of festival jury panels. As a result of cooperation with ethnomusicologists and folklore activists, a book version of folklore is created. This leads to fundamental change in traditional culture from originally oral to written, with all consequences of that phenomenon. Of course, I came here to Ong conception. Sometimes the again is to satisfy the wishes of ethnomusicologists assessing the folklore presentation is leading to caricature. The good example is a quote from a singer in the Meto family band. We had a master of art coming to us from the city of Łódź. He got together all the singers and told us to sing. So we sang song we know from our fathers, but he interrupted us. No, don't sing that. It's from a different region. So we sang again, and he goes, it's not the way it should be sung. You have to change the last verse. Finally, he told the band to play. When he saw the bass that my husband used to play throughout his entire life, he shouted, "What? 4 pegs? Remove one and seal the hole." In this region, basses had 3 strings. It is from the beginning of the 80s photo of this family band. In the opinion of Andrzej Bieńkowski, Folklore Festival had one more dimension related to the fact of giving great importance to archaic phenomena, as well as to the fact that the context of the competition required shortening and condensing of traditional behavior both in time and space. The wedding fiddlers had to adjust their repertoire and playing to the tastes of wedding guests, otherwise they would not be invited. The musician lowest in the rank, playing only for themselves or during neighborhood meetings, were not subject to this pressure. They played only for themselves and in a way petrified their skills from the past, carrying them to the present in a relative unchanged form. But on the other hand, the ability to vary of oberek in the country, it is the basic criterion of assessment of a fiddler skill, are limited. Simultaneously, the fate of the musical culture rooted in the peasant culture is sealed. The competitions and festivals of traditional music, which Jan Stęszewski included in the galvanizing trend, only postponed and keep postponing in inevitable process, bringing a temporary rise to the dying or dead traditions in their basic form. It seems that the communities of folklore activities, including those engaged in the festival movement, are becoming increasingly aware of that which is reflected in the appearance of rise and importance of invitatives similar to reviews of reconstructed folk music. Within these trends, an ever-growing group are the representatives of the youngest generation of Polish ethnomusicologists, preparing and publishing recordings, articles and popularization, brochures, creating and recording artistic projects, finally teaching in ethnomusicological workshops and taking part in festivals as jurors. In this way, it seems the particularly applied dimension of ethnomusicology will not only be prolonged into the future, but it will we must probably grow. Consequently, the impact of ethnomusicologists on the environment related to the traditional culture will grow, causing more profound modifications of the traditional culture itself. Thank you very much for your attention.